It's the essence of what makes Ruby Ruby. This is why I don't fully understand when people call for Ruby to add static typing, because to me, it's the bedrock of what this is. Why would you want to turn one of the most beautiful languages into something far uglier? This is one of my primary objections to static typing. It's not just that it limits you in certain ways, it makes metaprogramming harder. I write a bunch of metaprogramming. I've seen what it takes to do metaprogramming in TypeScript. That was actually one of the things that just really sent me on a tear of getting TypeScript out of some of the projects that I'm involved with. We pulled TypeScript out of Turbo, one of the front-end frameworks that we have, because I tried to write some metaprogramming in TypeScript and I was just infuriated. I don't want that experience. But I also don't want it from an aesthetic point of view. I hate repetition. We've just talked about how much I love that Ruby boils all of these expressions down to its essence. You can't remove one dot. You can't remove one character without losing something. This moment you go for static typing, that you declare at least, I know there are ways to do implied typing and so forth, but let's just take the stereotypical case of an example, for example. Capital U, user, I'm declaring the type of the variable. Lowercase user, I'm now naming my variable, equals uppercase user or new uppercase user. I've repeated user 3 times. I don't have time for this. I don't have sensibilities for this. I don't want my Ruby polluted with this. Now, I understand all the arguments for why people like static typing. One of the primary arguments is that it makes tooling easier. It makes it easier to do autocomplete in editors, for example. It makes it easier to find certain kinds of bugs because maybe you're calling methods that don't exist on an object and the editor can actually catch that bug before you even run it. I don't care. First of all, I don't write code with tools. I write them with text editors. I chisel them out of the screen with my bare hands. I don't autocomplete. And this is why I love Ruby so much. And this is why I continue to be in love with the text editor rather than the IDE. I don't want an IDE. I want my fingers to have to individually type out every element of it because it will force me to stay in the world where Ruby is beautiful. Because as soon as it gets easy to type a lot of boilerplate, well, guess what? You can have a lot of boilerplate. Every single language, basically, that has great tooling support has a much higher tolerance for boilerplate because the thinking is, well, you're not typing it anyway. You're just auto-completing it. I don't want that at all. I want something where the fabric I'm working in is just a text file. There's nothing else to it. So these things play together. There's the aesthetic part. There's the tooling part. There's the metaprogramming part. There's the fact that Ruby's ethos of duck typing, I don't know if you've heard that term before. It's essentially not about, can I call this method if a object is of a certain class? It is, can I call this method if the method responds? It's very out of small talk in that regard. You don't actually check of whether that class has the method, which allows you to dynamically add methods at runtime and do all sorts of really interesting things that underpin all the beautiful metaprogramming that we do in Ruby. I don't want to lose any of that. And I don't care for the benefits. One of the benefits I've seen touted over and over again is that it's much easier to write correct software. You're going to have fewer bugs. You're going to have less null pointer exceptions. You're going to have less all of this stuff. Yeah, I don't have any of that. It is just not something that occurs in my standard mode of operation. I'm not saying I don't have bugs. Of course I do. But I catch those bugs with unit testing, with integration testing. Those are the kinds of precautions that'll catch logical bugs, things that compile but are wrong, along with the uncompilable stuff. So I've never been drawn into this world. And part of it is because I work on a certain class of systems. I fully accept that. If you're writing systems that have 5, 10, 50 million lines of code with hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of programmers, I fully accept that you need different methods. What I object to is the idea that what's right for a code base of 10 million lines of code with 100,000 programmers working on it is also the same thing I should be using in my bedroom to create Basecamp because I'm just a single individual. That's complete nonsense. In the real world, we would know that that makes no sense at all. That you don't, I don't know, use your Pagani to go pick up groceries at Costco. It's a bad vehicle for that. It just doesn't have the space. You don't want to muddy the beautiful seats. You don't want to do any of those things. We know that certain things that are very good in certain domains don't apply to all. In programming languages, it seems like we forget that. Now, to be fair, I also had a little bit, perhaps, of a reputation of forgetting that. When I first learned Ruby, I was so head over heels in love with this programming language that I almost found it inconceivable that anyone would choose any other programming language at all to write web applications. And I kind of engaged the evangelism of Ruby on Rails in that spirit as a crusade, as I just need to teach you the gospel. I just need to show you this conditional code that we just talked about, and you will convert at the point of a sharp argument. Now, I learned that that's not the way. And part of the reason it's not the way is the programmers think differently. Our brains are configured differently. My brain is configured perfectly for Ruby, perfectly for a dynamically duck-typed language that I can chisel code out of a text editor with. And other people need the security of an IDE. They want the security of classes that won't compile unless you call them methods on it. I have come to accept that, but most programmers don't. They're still stuck in essentially, I like static typing, therefore, static typing is the only way to create reliable, correct systems, which is just such a mind-blowing, to be blunt, idiotic thing to say in the face of evidence, mountains of evidence to the contrary. This is one of the reasons I'm so in love with Shopify as the flagship application for Ruby on Rails. Shopify exists at a scale that most programmers will never touch. On Black Friday, I think Shopify did 1 million requests per second. That's not 1 million requests of images. That's of dynamic requests that are funneling through the pipeline of commerce. I mean, Shopify runs something like 30% of all e-commerce stores on the damn internet. A huge portion of all commerce in total runs through Shopify, and that runs on Ruby on Rails. So Ruby on Rails is able to scale up to that level without using static typing in all of what it does. Now, I know they've done certain experiments in certain ways because they are hitting some of the limits that you will hit with dynamic typing. And some of those limits you hit with dynamic typing are actually, by the way, just limits you hit when you write 5 million lines of code. I think the Shopify monolith is about 5 million lines of code. At that scale, everything breaks because you're at the frontier of what humans are capable of doing with programming languages. The difference in part is that Ruby is such a succinct language that those 5 million, if they'd been written in, let's just say, Go or Java, would have been 50 or 25. Now, that might have alleviated some of the problems that you have when you work on huge systems with many programmers, but it certainly would also have compounded them. Try to understand 25 million lines of code.
So the thing does scale. That's the persistent myth that it doesn't scale. Shopify and others, but Shopify I think is a great example. By the way, I love Shopify and I love Toby.
You gotta have Toby on.
Yeah,
just talked to him this morning.
For sure. He's a brilliant. I got to hang out with him in the desert somewhere, I forget, in Utah. He's just a brilliant human. And Shopify.com/Lex has been supporting this podcast for the longest time. I don't think actually Toby knows that they sponsor this podcast. I mean, it's a big company, right?
It's a huge company. I think just under 10,000 employees, market cap of 120 billion, GMV of $250 billion every quarter.
And he's involved with the details still.
He is, very much so. A funny story about Toby. Toby was on the Rails core team back in the mid-2000s. Toby himself wrote Active Merchant, which is one of the frameworks for creating shops. He wrote the Liquid templating language that Shopify still uses to this day. He has a huge list of contributions to the Rails ecosystem, and he's the CEO of the company. I think it's very inspiring to me because it's such at the opposite end of what I like to do. I like to chisel code with my own hands most of the day. He runs a company of almost 10,000 people that is literally like world commerce depends on it. A level of criticality I can't even begin to understand. And yet we can see eye to eye on so many of these fundamental questions in computer science and program development. That is a dynamic range. To be able to encompass Rails being a great tool for the one developer who's just starting out with an idea, who don't even fully know everything, who is right at the level where PHP would have been a good fit in those late 90s because, I could probably upload something to an FTP server and so on. Rails does have more complexity than that, but it also has so much longer runway. The runway goes all the way to goddamn Shopify. That is about the most convincing argument I can make for sort of dynamic range, that we can do a lot of it. And even having said that, Shopify is the outlier, of course. I don't think about Shopify as the primary target when I write Rails. I think of the single developer. Actually, I do think about Shopify. But I don't think about Shopify now. I think of Shopify when Toby was writing Snow Devil, which was the first e-commerce store to sell snowboards that he created. That was the pre-Shopify. He created all by himself. And that was possible because Ruby on Rails isn't just about beautiful code. It's just as much about productivity. It's just as much about the impact that an individual programmer is able to have. That they can build a system where they can keep the whole thing in their head and be able to move it forward such that you can go from one developer sitting and working on something, and that something is Shopify, and it turns into what it is today. When we talk about programming languages and we compare them, we often compare them at a very late stage. Like, what is the better programming language for, let's say, Twitter in 2009, when it's already a huge success? Twitter was started on Ruby on Rails. They then hit some scaling problems. It was a big debacle at the time. They end up then, I think, writing it in some other language, which, by the way, I think is the best advertisement ever for Ruby on Rails, because nothing fucking happened for 10 years after they switched over, right? Essentially zero innovation. Some of that was because they were doing a long conversion, and all of the early success in part came because they had the agility to quickly change and adopt and so forth. That's what startups need. That's what Shopify needed. That's what Twitter needed. That's what everyone needs. And that's the number one priority for Ruby on Rails, to make sure that we don't lose that. Because what happens so often when development tools and programming language are driven by huge companies is that they mirror their org chart. React and everything else needed to use that is in some ways a reflection of how Meta builds Facebook. Because of course it is. Because of course it's a distraction of that. I'm not saying React isn't a great tool and that can't be used by smaller teams. Of course it can. But it's born in a very different context than something like Ruby on Rails.
Let me say as a small aside, because I think we might return to Shopify and celebrate it often. Just a sort of personal note. This particular podcast has way more sponsors and sponsors that want to be sponsors than I could possibly ever have. And it's really, really important for me to not give a shit and to be able to celebrate people. Like, I celebrate people, I celebrate companies, and I don't care that they're sponsoring. I really don't care. I just want to make that very explicit because we're going to continue saying positive things about Shopify. I don't care. Stop sponsoring. It doesn't really matter to me. But yeah, I just want to make that explicit. So, but to linger on the scaling thing with the Twitter and the Shopify, can you just explain to me what Shopify is doing with the JIT? What did they have to try to do to scale this thing? Because that's kind of an incredible story, right?
Yeah, so one of the great contributions that Shopify has made to the entire Ruby ecosystem, not just Rails, but in particular Rails, is YJIT. So YJIT is their compiler for Ruby that just makes everything a lot more efficient. And at Shopify scale, eking out even a 5-10% improvement in Ruby's overhead and execution time is a huge deal. Now, Shopify didn't need YJIT. Shopify was already running on the initial version of Ruby that was, I think, 10 times slower than what we have today. If you look back upon the Ruby 1.8.6 that Toby probably started on, just as I started on, and that was enough to propel Shopify to the scale that it has today. A lot of the scaling conversation is lost in a failure to distinguish two things. Scale is kind of one package we talk about when there are really multiple packages inside of it. One is runtime performance, latency. How fast can you execute a single request? Can it happen fast enough that the user will not notice? If your Rails request takes 1.5 seconds to execute, the user's going to notice. Your app is going to feel slow and sluggish. You have to get that response time down below, let's say, at least 300 milliseconds. I like to target 100 milliseconds as my latency. That's kind of performance. How much performance of that kind of latency can you squeeze out of a single CPU core? That tells you something about what the price of a single request will be. But then whether you can deal with 1 million requests a second, like Shopify is doing right now, if you have one box that can do 1,000 requests a second, you just need X boxes to get up to 1 million. And what you'll actually find is that when it comes to programming languages, they're all the same in this way. They all scale largely, beautifully horizontally. You just add more boxes. The hard parts of scaling a Shopify is typically not the programming language. It's the database. And that's actually one of the challenges that Shopify has now is how do you deal with MySQL at the scale that they're operating at? When do you need to move to other databases to get worldwide performance? All of these things. The questions about scaling Ruby are economic questions. If we're spending so and so much on application servers, if we can get just 5% more performance out of Ruby, well, we could save 5% of those servers, and that could filter down into the budget. Now, that analysis concludes into basically one thing. Ruby is a luxury language. It's a luxury, the highest luxury, in my opinion. It is the Coco Chanel of programming languages, something that not everyone can afford. And I mean this in the best possible way. There are some applications on the internet where each request has so little value, you can't afford to use a luxurious language like Ruby to program in it. You simply have to slum it with a C or a Go or some other low-level language or a Rust. Talk about line noise there
That's
for a
like
hot second.
the thrift store of languages.
Exactly. Where you need you need a very low level to do it. You can't afford to use a luxury language to build it with. That's not true of Shopify. It wasn't true of Basecamp even back in 2004. It's not been true of 99% of all web applications ever created, because the main cost component of 99% of web applications is not CPU cores. It's wet cores. It's human cores. It's human capacity to understand and involve systems. It's their personal productivity. I did a calculation once when someone had, for the 400th time, said that, if you switch from Ruby to some faster language, you could save a bunch of money. I calculated it out that at the time, and I think the last time I did this calculation was almost a decade ago, we were spending about 15% of our operating budget on Ruby application servers. So for me to improve my cost profile of the business by 7 percentage points, I'd have to pick something twice as fast. That's quite hard. Versus if Ruby and Rails was even 10% more productive than something else, I would move the needle far more, because making individual programmers more productive actually matters a lot more. This is why people are so excited about AI. This is why they're freaking out over the fact that a single programmer in Silicon Valley who makes $300,000 a year can now do the work of 3 or 5, at least in theory. I haven't actually seen that fully in practice, but let's just assume the theory is correct. If not now, then in 6 months. That's a huge deal. That matters so much more than whether you can squeeze a few more cycles out of the CPU when it comes to these kinds of business applications. If you're making Unreal Engine rendering stuff like Tim Sweeney you had on, he needs to really sweat all those details. The Nanite engine can't run on Ruby. It's never going to. It was not meant for that. Fine. These kinds of business applications absolutely can. And everything that people are excited about AI for right now, that extra capacity to just do more, that was why we were excited about Ruby back in the early 2000s. That was because I saw that if we could even squeeze out a 10% improvement of the human programmer, we'd be able to do so much more for so much less.
Probably argue about this, but I really like working together with AI, collaborating with AI. And I would argue that the kind of code you want AI to generate is human readable, human interpretable.
Yes.
If it's generating Perl golf code, it's not a collaboration. So it has to be speaking the human. It's not just you're writing the prompts in English. You also want to read the responses in the human interpretable language like Ruby, right? So that's actually is beneficial for AI too, because you kind of said that for you, the sculptor, the sort of the elitist Coco Chanel sculptor, you want to on your fancy keyboard to type every single letter yourself with your own fingers. But it's also that the benefit of Ruby also applies when some of that is written by AI and you're actually doing with your own fingers the editing part.
Yes.
Because you can interact with it because it's human interpretable.
The paradigm I really love with this was something Elon actually said on one of your shows when you guys were talking about Neuralink, that Neuralink allows the bandwidth between you and the machine to increase. That language, either spoken or written, is very low bandwidth. If you are to calculate just how many bits we can exchange as we're sitting here, it's very slow. Ruby has a much higher bandwidth of communication, conveys so much more concept per character than most other programming languages do. So when you are collaborating with AI, you want really high bandwidth. You want it to be able to produce programs with you, whether you're letting it write the code or not, that both of you can actually understand really quickly, and that you can compress a grand concept, a grand system into far fewer parts that both of you can understand. Now, I actually love collaborating with AI too. I love chiseling my code, and the way I use AI is in a separate window. I don't let it drive my code. I've tried that. I've tried the cursors and the windsurfs, and I don't enjoy that way of writing. And one of the reasons I don't enjoy that way of writing is I can literally feel competence draining out of my fingers. Like that level of immediacy with the material disappears. And where I felt this the most was I did this remix of Ubuntu called Amacube when I switched to Linux. And it's all written in Bash. I'd never written any serious amount of code in Bash before.
Yeah.
So I was using AI to collaborate to write a bunch of Bash with me because I needed all this. I knew what I wanted. I could express it in Ruby, but I thought it was an interesting challenge to filter through Bash because what I was doing was setting up a Linux machine. That's basically what Bash was designed for. It's a great constraint. But what I found myself doing was asking AI for the same way of expressing a conditional, for example, in Bash over and over again. That by not typing it, I wasn't learning it. I was using it. I was getting the expression I wanted, but I wasn't learning it. And I got a little scared. Like, is this the end of learning? Am I no longer learning if I'm not typing? And the way for me, recast that was I don't want to give up on the AI. It is such a better experience as a programmer to look up APIs, to get a second opinion on something, to do a draft. But I have to do the typing myself because you learn with your fingers. If you're learning how to play the guitar, you can watch as many YouTube videos as you want. You're not going to learn the guitar. You have to put your fingers on the strings to actually learn the motions. And I think there is a parallel here to programming where programming has to be learned in part by the actual typing.
I'm just really this is fascinating. Listen, part of my brain agrees with you 100%, part doesn't. I think AI should be in the loop of learning. Now, current systems don't do that. But I think it's very possible for Cursor to basically force you to type certain things. So like if you set the mode of learning, I don't want to be this sort of give up on AI. I think vibe coding is a skill. So for an experienced programmer, it's too easy to dismiss vibe coding as a thing.
I agree. I wouldn't dismiss it.
But I think you need to start building that skill and start to figure out how do you prevent the competency from slipping away from your fingers and brain. Like how do you develop that skill in parallel to the other skill? I don't know. I think it's a fascinating puzzle though. I know too many really strong programmers that just kind of avoid AI because it's currently a little too dumb.
Yes, it's a little too slow is actually my main problem. It's a little too dumb in some ways, but it's a little too slow in other ways. When I use Claude's code, the terminal version of Claude, which is actually my preferred way of using it, I get too impatient. It feels like I'm going back to a time where code had to compile and I had to go do something else, boil some tea while the code is compiling. Well, I've been working in Ruby for 20 years. I don't have compile weight in me anymore. So there's that aspect of it. But I think the more crucial aspect for me is I really care about the competence. And I've seen what happens to even great programmers the moment they put away the keyboard. Because even before AI, this would happen as soon as people would get promoted. Most great programmers who work in large businesses stop writing code on a daily basis because they simply have too many meetings to attend to. They have too many other things to do. And invariably, they lose touch with programming. That doesn't mean they forget everything. But if you don't have your fingers in the sauce, the source, you are going to lose touch with it. There's just no other way. I don't want that because I enjoy it too much. This is not just about outcomes. This is what's crucial to understand. Programming for programmers who like to code is not just about the programs they get out of it. That may be the economic value. It's not the only human value. The human value is just as much in the expression. When someone who sits down on a guitar and plays Stairways to Heaven, there's a perfect recording of that will last in eternity. You can just put it on Spotify. You don't actually need to do it. The joy is to command the guitar yourself. The joy of a programmer, of me as a programmer, is to type the code myself. If I elevate myself, if I promote myself out of programming, I turn myself into a project manager of a murder of AI crows, as I wrote the other day. I could have become a project manager my whole career. I could have become a project manager 20 years ago if I didn't care to write code myself and I just wanted outcomes. That's how I got started in programming. I just wanted outcomes. Then I fell in love with programming. And now I'd rather retire than giving it up. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have your cake and eat it too. I've done some vibe coding where I didn't care that I wasn't playing myself. I just wanted to see something. There was an idea in my head. I wanted to see something. That's fine. I also use AI all day long. In fact, I'm already at the point where if you took it away from me, I'd be like, oh my God, how do we even look things up on the internet anymore? Is Stack Overflow still around? Are forums still a thing? Like, how do I even find answers to some of these questions I have all day long? I don't want to give up AI. In fact, I'd say the way I like to use AI, I'm getting smarter every day because of AI, because I'm using AI to have it explain things to me, even stupid questions. I would be a little embarrassed to even enter into Google. AI is perfectly willing to give me the ELI 5 explanation of some Unix command I should have known already, but I don't. I'm sorry. Can you just explain it to me? And now I know the thing. So at the end of the day of me working with AI all day long, I'm a little bit smarter, like 5%. Sorry, not 5%, 0.5%, maybe. That compounds over time. But what I've also seen when I worked on the Omiku project and I tried to let AI drive for me, I felt I was maybe 0.5% dumber at the end of the day.
Okay, you said a lot of interesting things. First of all, let's just start with the very fact that asking dumb questions. If you go to Stack Overflow and ask a dumb question, or read somebody else's dumb question and the answer to it, there's a lot of judgment there.
Yes.
AI, sometimes to an excessive degree, has no judgment. It usually says, "Oh, that's a great question."
To a fault.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, it's so conducive to learning. It's such a wonderful tool for learning, and I too would miss it. And it's a great, basically, search engine into all kinds of nuances of a particular programming language, especially if you don't know it that well. Or like APIs, you can load in documentation. It's just so great for learning. For me personally, on the happiness scale, it makes me more excited to program. I don't know what that is exactly. Part of that is I'm really sorry. Stack Overflow is an incredible website, but there is a negativity there.
Yes.
There's a judgment there. It's just exciting to be with a hype man next to me, just like saying, "Yeah, that's a great idea," and I'll say, "No, that's wrong." I'll correct the AI, and and the AI will say, "You're absolutely right. How did I not think about that?" Rewrite the code. I'm like, "Holy shit!" It's like a buddy that's like really being positive and is very smart and is challenging me to think. And even if I never use the code it generates, I'm already a better programmer. But actually, the deeper thing is, for some reason, I'm having more fun. That's a really, really important thing.
I like to think of it as a pair programmer for exactly that
Yeah,
reason.
yeah.
Pair programming came vogue in like the 2000s, where you'd have two programmers in front of one machine and you'd push the keyboard between you. One programmer would be driving, they'd be typing in. The other programmer would essentially sit and watch the code, suggest improvements, look something up. That was a really interesting dynamic. Now, unfortunately, I'm an introvert, so I can do that for about 5 minutes
Yeah.
before I want to jump off a bridge. So it doesn't work for me as a full-time occupation. But AI allows me to have all the best of that experience all the time. Now, I think what's really interesting when you said about it makes it more fun. I hadn't actually thought about that, but what it's made more fun to me is to be a beginner again. It made it more fun to learn Bash successfully for the first time. Now, I had to do the detour where I let it write all the code for me, and I realized I wasn't learning nearly as much as I hoped I would, and that I started doing once I typed it out myself. But it gave me the confidence that, you know what, if I need to do some iOS programming myself, I haven't done that in probably 6 years. Was the last time I dabbled in it. I never really built anything for real. I feel highly confident now that I could sit down with AI and I could have something in the App Store by the end of the week. I would not have that confidence unless I had a pair programming buddy like AI. I don't actually use it very much for Ruby code. I'm occasionally impressed whenever I try it. Like, oh, it got this one thing right. That is truly remarkable. And it's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
And then I'll ask it two more questions and I go like, yeah, okay. If you were my junior programmer, I'd start tapping my fingers and going like, you gotta shape up. Now, the great thing, of course, is we can just wait 5 minutes. The Anthropic CEO seems to think that 90% of all code by the end of the year is going to be written by AI. I'm more than a little bit skeptical about that, but I'm open-minded about the prospect that programming potentially will turn into a horse when done manually. Something we do recreationally is no longer a mode of transportation to get around LA. You're not going to saddle up and go to the grocery store and pick up stuff from Whole Foods in your saddlebags. That's just not a thing anymore. That could be the future for programming, for manual programming. Entirely possible. I also don't care. Like, even though we have great renditions of all the best songs, as I said, there are millions of people who love to play the guitar. It may no longer have as much economic value as it once did. I think that I'm quite convinced is true, that we perhaps have seen the peak. Now, I understand the paradox when the price of something goes down, actually the overall usage goes up and total spend on that activity goes up. That could also happen, maybe. But what we're seeing right now is that a lot of the big shops, a lot of the big companies are not hiring like they were 5 years ago. They're not anticipating they're going to need tons more programmers. Controversially, Toby actually put out a memo inside of Shopify asking everyone who's considering hiring someone to ask the question, could this be done by AI?